Thanks very much to Hakeem and to Steve for inviting me to talk, and for Maggie to introduce me. I very much enjoyed the presentation that Mark just gave. I've been working on studies looking at the links between pollution and performance on academic tests, and we actually looked at Detroit, and everything that Mark said matches perfectly with the data that we've been getting. What I want to talk about, though, in my presentation is another form of environmental racism and injustice, or I should say another form of racism and injustice, and that's environmental racism. How many people have heard that term? Okay, almost everyone. Okay. So what I'm going to do is to explain a little bit of the history of this issue, very short history, and I'll obviously can't talk about everything that's happened on this, but I want to give a short history of environmental justice. I want to talk about the different meanings that people have given it, to it, and then I also want to talk about how environmental justice or injustice affects Michigan in particular. I'm sure that if people have heard the term environmental racism in the room, everybody's heard about the Flint water crisis, something that was very much in the news 2 years ago. It's faded from the news quite a bit, but as far as I can tell, the problems are still severe in Flint. It's just that the media is not focusing on it as it did before. So people should, as much as they can, follow what's going on in Flint, because the problems have not been solved. And I want to address some of that in my presentation. I also want to talk about Southwest Detroit, because that's another environmental injustice hotspot in Michigan. But in giving this, Maggie, will that work, the microphone? I find it real, can people, oops. Can people? Okay. Now I know it works. It's easier for me to walk around. I can see the slides and I can see what you see. Well, I guess at this point, over 30 years ago, these protests in Warren County, North Carolina, over the state's decision to place a hazardous waste PCB landfill in a predominantly African-American community in Warren County was one of the, may have been the first event really to get national attention, focusing on the issue of environmental racism and injustice. There were other events like it going on maybe even before Warren County, but what was unique about Warren County, several things actually. One is that it got national attention, and it also started a chain reaction that led to other outcomes, that led to other outcomes, and so on. So it became quite a famous event, and if you read anything in the published literature about environmental justice, especially its history, Warren County will certainly be mentioned. I wanted to say something about why I think it got the attention that it did. If you look at this picture, which has become somewhat of an iconic picture of Warren County's protest, you can see people laying across the road, daring trucks with hazardous waste to roll over them. And in the early 1980s, I don't think that we were that far away yet from the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and I think these kind of images coming out of the Warren County protests got the media's attention and the national attention. That it was, they were using tactics reminiscent of the civil rights movement is not an accident, because the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ was helping the residents, and Reverend Benjamin Chavis, who's in the middle of the photo on the podium, announcing a report that the Commission for Racial Justice had produced in March of 1987. He helped the protesters, and he later went on to become the executive director for the NAACP, and already had a lot of civil rights experience by this time. Warren County was one of the first events to get attention between the links between pollution and racial injustice. But what Reverend Chavis, one of the things that came to his mind was the question of whether what they were seeing in Warren County and other places in the South were part of a national pattern. And so he got this idea of trying to do a national level study looking at the distribution of environmental or hazardous waste sites and to link it with census data to see if a national level study would reveal patterns. Of course, the United Church of Christ is not a research institution, so they got experts to do this analysis. But essentially, what was done was to find the locations of all the hazardous waste sites in the U.S. and then to link it to zip code level census data. And one of the things that the analysis found that zip codes that had hazardous waste facilities in them, the people of color percentage was double that of zip codes that did not have a hazardous waste facility in them. And zip code areas that had 2 or more, the people of color percentage was triple. And when they used multivariate statistical analysis, they found that when they looked at things like property values and average incomes and other things, that the racial composition of the zip codes actually turned out to be the best predictor of where those hazardous waste facilities were located. In 1987, the University of Michigan has a little bit of history on this issue, and I'm proud to say that I was involved with my colleague, Professor Bunyan Bryant. I came to the school as an assistant professor in 1987. I didn't know about the United Church of Christ report. However, I was working on a study where I was trying to analyze a national database to compare African American and white American attitudes about the environment. It was an excellent data base, but so little had been written about African American concerns about the environment. I didn't have much in terms of literature review or developing hypotheses other than using the conventional wisdoms. But when I came in to school in 1987, I met my colleague, Dr. Bunyan Bryant, and he's very photogenic, very good-looking guy. He won't be hard to spot. He's the man on the right side in the pink shirt and the gray tie. He was absolutely the first African American environmental studies professor I'd ever met, and I figured he might be able to help me. So I was telling him about my project and asked him for advice about things I should read, and he gave me suggestions for about 6 or 8 articles, but the most important one was this report, Toxic Waste and Race, which I didn't know anything about until he gave me a copy of it. And I read it from cover to cover, and it literally changed my life, because in the 70s and 80s, we tended to think about or talk about pollution and environmental contamination as something that affects all of us, and therefore it affects us all equally. And here was a report that was saying something different. It was saying that, well, some people are more impacted than others. One of the things that it led me to do was to try to see if other studies like it already existed and whether they pointed in the same direction as the United Church of Christ study. And I found about a dozen, and they did all point in the same direction. But Dr. Bryant and I decided to do several projects together. One was to organize this conference that we called the Michigan Conference on Race and the Incidence of Environmental Hazards. And our main objective was to identify and bring together everyone we could who was already working on this issue to come to the University of Michigan campus and to talk about their research and what their findings revealed. And we were very much interested also in seeing how we could use these findings to affect policy. So one of the ideas that we had, and it's almost 30 years ago, but I'm pretty sure it came from Dr. Bryant, is, well, let's not just stop with the researchers, let's also invite people from the EPA and also from our Michigan Department of Natural Resources, not to make presentations, but just to come and listen. And that's what we did. In this group photo that we took, it doesn't have everybody that was at the conference, but quite a few people in that photo are actually people from the EPA and from the Michigan DNR. And one of the people from the EPA was actually someone that was fairly highly placed. He had direct access to the administrator and also to the White House. And the conferees decided they were going to write a letter to the head of EPA to inform him about this issue. Maggie had mentioned that the EPA gave us credit, or partial credit at least, for bringing this issue to their attention. The other thing being the report Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. But anyway, this person, his name was Rob Walcott from the EPA, helped us to draft the letter and to frame it in a way that it would get the administrator's attention. And we sent that letter not only to the administrator, but to every member of Congress, every governor in the United States. And just remember, back then, we didn't have we weren't all that advanced technologically. We had WordStar. If you're my age, you might remember that. But we didn't have the internet, so we actually had to write physical copies, and it was pretty tough because we were trying to make sure the right letter got to the right person that we addressed. Anyway, it was an amazing amount of time to do this, but it all worked. We got invited to meet with the administrator in September of 1990, and he was already primed to believe that this was an important issue that the EPA should work on. And one of the things that he did was he organized this internal work group that he called the Environmental Equity Work Group, and their charge was to research the evidence and to come up with recommendations back to the agency on what the EPA could do to address environmental racism and injustice. And I guess 2 years later, they came out with this report. It came out in June of 1992. It was called Environmental Equity, Reducing Risk for All Communities. I looked it up online. It's still available. Or I shouldn't say it's still available. Somebody took, a copying machine and then made a PDF out of it and uploaded it. But you can easily find this report. It got very, very heavily criticized for not going far enough, and I shared that criticism, but I knew this was an enormously important report because it was the first official acknowledgement by the federal government that this problem was a legitimate problem and that something ought to be done about it. It almost immediately led to a series of hearings in the House of Representatives and a number of bills being passed. The speed of which this happened was quite remarkable. And in less than 2 years after that, in February of 1994, President Clinton signs Executive Order 12898, which calls on all the agencies of the federal government, not just the EPA, to take into account the environmental justice consequences of their actions. That's been the high watermark in terms of policy on environmental justice. No law has been passed. I believe that that's been a big hole. Everybody in the room knows how easy it is to pass a law, especially in today's climate. But that's where we are right now. That this is as far as I know, this executive order is still in place. It's served as a model for a lot of executive directives and policy around at the state level, including Michigan. Let me just, I'm going to maybe just jump over that a little because I know I'm limited in time. In 2007 was the 20th anniversary of Toxic Waste and Race, and the United Church of Christ had asked Professor Robert Bullard, who's very famous on this issue, to do an updated issue. And Dr. Bullard, I've known him ever since our conference back in 1990. He knew that I was working on methods to try to improve how to measure the racial and socioeconomic disparities around hazardous sites. So he invited me to join him on this project, and two other people. And what we did by using geographic information systems and methods that take into account the demographics and uniform distances around hazardous sites, we actually found that 56% of the people living within 3 kilometers of a hazardous waste facility are people of color, in contrast to 30% beyond that distance. And likewise, poverty rates are higher, and housing values and incomes are lower in those areas. One of the other things we did was we did the analysis on a state-by-state level, and what you see in this particular figure is the top 10 states in terms of degree of disparity. California has the greatest concentration of people of color within 3 kilometers of hazardous waste facilities there, but Michigan has about 67%. 2/3 of the people that live within 3 kilometers of a hazardous waste facility are people of color. And it's actually the disparities are actually greater for Michigan if you were to we sorted this based on the concentration of people of color overall, but if you look at the contrast between the proportion of people of color within 3 kilometers versus beyond 3 kilometers, that's in what we call the non-host areas, that ratio is bigger than for California. In fact, it's the biggest ratio. So if you want to ask the question, where are the disparities greatest state by state, they're really in Michigan. Michigan comes out looking bad in a lot of fronts when we look hard at the data. I have slides about the different meanings, but again, I'm going to skip over that maybe to talk a little bit more about the data. Two of the places I want to focus on right now is Flint. There's an excellent documentary called "Here's to Flint." You can find it on YouTube. Just type in "Here's to Flint." It's an excellent documentary that was made by the Michigan ACLU. It's about 45 minutes long and gives you a very good explanation of what happened, the timeline, who did what. It's an excellent documentary. I use it for my classes and public talks. I highly recommend it. 2 years ago, the governor put together a task force, the Flint Water Advisory Task Force, to document what happened in Flint. And frankly, the governor and his appointed emergency managers, Mark had mentioned the emergency managers in Michigan. 15 people have been indicted for their role in the Flint water crisis. 2 of them are emergency managers. Emergency managers are more or less, this simplifies it a little bit, but they're essentially state-appointed dictators that totally override the authority of the mayors, the city councils, and the school boards. And I think a lot of people who have played a responsibility in the Flint water crisis like to play on the confusion about what really happened in Flint. It was not the city that decided to switch to the Flint River, for example. It did decide that it wanted to get off the Detroit water system because of the cost, but their idea was to connect to a water pipeline that would go directly from Lake Huron to the city. But once this state-appointed emergency manager was put in place, he decided to switch to the Flint River in the interim. And then the state DEQ never made sure that the proper treatment was added to the water. And as we all know, the water got contaminated and people got poisoned, not only with lead, but other kinds of harms that led to Legionnaire's disease and increases in Legionnaire's death. And then once the people began, the citizens, the residents began to complain, their complaints were ignored, and even when the scientific evidence came in, and many of you may know the details when Mark Edwards from BPI demonstrated the elevated lead in the water in Flint, the first response from the state was to try to discredit his study. And then when Mohai and Tisha discovered the increases in blood lead levels in the children in Flint, their first reaction was to try to discredit her study. And it took a year and a half, I think probably more due to the increasing media attention, that the governor's office and the state finally admitted that there was a problem. There's another report that came out just last year by the Michigan Civil Rights Commission called "The Flint Water Crisis: Systemic Racism Through the Lens of Flint." Also gives an accounting of the racial history of Flint, very detailed history of the racial discrimination and development in Flint. And like the Flint Water Task Force of a year earlier, it recommended that it had a certain set of recommendations to deal with the problem. And I have to say, I know that not everybody would agree with me, but I personally felt very disappointed by the recommendations in this report, because I didn't really sense that the recommendations were going to meet the needs of the residents. And throughout this whole crisis, the lack of sense of urgency in Flint by the state government to me has just been astounding. The children remain sick. The people died with the Legionnaire's disease, and I have not heard anything about taking care of them in the long run or compensating their harm. And at the same time, this is something that may surprise a lot of people, the residents have actually been forced to pay for the poisoned water, which is amazing. If you were to go to the store and bought a gallon of milk and it was spoiled, what would you do? You'd take it, I would take it back, you know, at least put up a fuss, exchange it, get my money back. You buy a new refrigerator, if it's broken, you expect, you know, take it back, they'll make it right. But can you imagine that they're charging people for the poisoned water? And you might say to yourself, well, how, you know, who in their right mind would pay for the poisoned water? Well, there's some very interesting threats that are used against the residents. If you don't pay your water bill, they shut off your water, and then they'll take your children away. And so it's not just that the people haven't been compensated; they continue to suffer harm. Well, my understanding is the water quality has improved, but not to the levels that they would be here in Ann Arbor. And again, all the damage that's been done have yet to be addressed. I called it, I was contacted by some reporters. I said that this was the biggest environmental justice disaster that I know of since I started working on this issue 30 years ago. And I'm out of time, but I just want to mention one other thing, that the Flint water crisis, that was the first time where I saw an environmental injustice incident where the media actually used the words environmental racism and environmental injustice. And because of the media interest, it's worldwide. It's not just in the U.S. There's media in other countries that have been reporting on the Flint water crisis. It also started to bring attention to Southwest Detroit, which some people refer to. Well, zip code 48217 is the most polluted zip code in Michigan, and this was an article that came out. It was a cover article for Newsweek 2 years ago. And some of the information that was used was based on research that I did with my colleagues and students. One of the things that we did was we showed air pollution burdens from industrial sources, and we mapped the hot spots. So what you see in this map is pollution concentrations in 1 kilometer squares, which you can't see because they're so small at this scale. But this shows the dark blue area is the pollution concentrations at the top 1% percentile. And then we drew the sulfur dioxide non-attainment area. Look how, I won't say perfectly matched, but the bluest areas are in the northern half of the sulfur dioxide area. And if you look at it, oh, I did manage to get that slide in. This matches Mark's presentation. I've got a paper I'd like to give to Mark afterwards. This graph represents, we used the National Air Toxic Assessment, and anything, these are all ratios. There was something like 63 schools in the non-attainment area. And what we did was we looked at the National Air Toxic Assessment scores within 2 kilometers of the schools. And you can see that every one of the 63 schools that the respiratory risk ratio is above 1. So anything 1 or below is considered within safe levels. Anything above 1 is bad. It's beyond what's considered safe. But you can see every school in that 63, or every one of those 63 schools are way above that ratio. And then here, whoops, and this is my last slide. I had one of my research assistant, Ember McCoy. Ember, are you in the room? Okay, Ember McCoy did an excellent job on the GIS work. And you can see the location of zip code 48217. The residents call themselves the most polluted zip code in Michigan, and it was based on these analyses. Thank you very much. I've run out of time.